flavor and cooking and food, that this was actually a joy for me and a good excuse to work on some other topics that I have as like side projects on flavor and taste in particular and how they relate to smell. So thanks for having me. I wish I could tell you that I have a clear thesis and a well worked out conclusion, but since this is the half-baked series, I'm going to give a half-baked talk, and I hope that you forgive me for that. Part of this is that it's empirically informed philosophy, so sometimes I want to make arguments or say things, but I'm waiting for the experimental research to provide enough data that I can actually conclusively make claims. And the last time I was working on at least mental imagery of olfaction and flavor, this was back in 2019. So when I thought, oh, I'll talk on, in the end, the mental imagery of flavors, the scientists must have figured out what's going on there in the last 6 to 7 years. And then I went to the literature and turns out not quite as much as I would like. So you'll notice that the abstract is more of a promissory note and that I wish it wasn't, but we'll see how it goes. So we're going to be exploring mental imagery about flavors. And for the most part, I'm going to use this as an excuse to kind of quality test some theories that I've been proposing over the years. So one of them is that in the end, mental imagery is part of like quasi-perceptual processing. And if mental imagery is quasi-perceptual processing relative to the representational format of a modality, then we expect it to have more or less the same format when we imagine smells or flavors or tastes as we would when we perceive smells or flavors or tastes, whatever those might be. Now, that already is one claim. So we're going to be bracketing mental theories of mental imagery that are not quasi-perceptual. So the belief-based ones or the access-based ones or even the pictorial-based ones, because pictorial imagery will certainly not work when it comes to smell. So bracketing those and just talking about quasi-perceptual processing of mental imagery. The other thing is I made this claim in my book on stinking philosophy that flavor is mostly in the end retronasal olfaction and it's not really gustation. And the problem is going to be trying to figure out if it turns out to be that flavor imagery is just like flavor perception, then what format does flavor imagery have? And that was going to be the question I was going to try to address in the talk. And I think I got somewhere, but you'll see that the conclusion is not as conclusive as I'd like it to be. The other thing that I would like to talk about today is trying to figure out why, in the end, we're better at flavor imagery than we are at olfactory imagery, because I think that's something interesting that comes out about the literature. But let's start with just imagining flavors. Okay, so when I talk about imagining, I'm going to mean something like mental imagery. When my kids found out that I was invited to give a talk in Milan, we had just been in Milan in August, so they were going like, "Oh, if you're going to be in Milan again, you have to go get gelato by the Duomo." And they have like one, of course, place that we went to must have been like every single day we were in Milan to have ice cream at 11 o'clock because it's not quite lunchtime yet, right? But at the same time, you need something sugary to get through the hot August days. So we all have eaten gelato, right? I mean, this is a given experience that I assume everyone has. And we can easily imagine the flavors of it. But when you start thinking about what you're imagining, when you're imagining the flavor of consuming gelato, it's not clear. And there's a lot of different facets that you could focus on the experience. I mean, so just looking at the image that you have in front of you, you'll notice that you have the sprinkles, right, which I know is not going to be a traditional kind of thing to add in, but the sprinkles are going to give you some sort of textural quality, right? The ice cream won't really, for the most part, have much of an olfactory smell, right? And because it's not really decaying quite as much, so as you bring it close to your nose, you don't get much of a smell. But the moment you get on tongue, then all of a sudden you have thermal reception, you have the feeling of the fats that are slowly in the end falling apart on your tongue, and then you begin to get the flavor of it, right? The taste of it. And all of these are coming together. And if you bit off some of the chunks of the cone, then you're getting the sweet caramelized stuff with that textural qualities too. So flavor imagery, and I think we can do this, turns out to be very complex. And the wonder is going to be, well, what kind of format does that take? Okay, so the wonder is going to be if in the end flavor imagery has the same kind of format as perceptual imagery when it comes to flavors. The problem that I run into, sorry, is that in the end, when we start thinking about flavor, the question is going to be what is flavor? And I think that smell and gustation and taste can in the end be individuated from each other. And the problem we run into when we start thinking about tasting flavors is that flavors are going to be multisensory but unimodal. So they're going to be formed from smell and gustation, and smell and gustation are going to play some sort of role. But nonetheless, flavor is going to be above and beyond the component parts. So to that extent, we might want to think about what the difference between smell, gustation, and taste might be. And I, of course, have a theory here and an argument that I think is a little bit novel, but if you agree with me and go, this is trivial, that's great too. So when it comes to smell, we have two different pathways for smell. And since this is a group that works on, I guess, food, right, and culinary aspects, then you probably have this distinction in hand. So we have orthonasal olfaction. Orthonasal olfaction is what I think we call smell in everyday discourse. And this is smells that come from the front of the nose, whereby the odorants in the end come up through the nasal capacity, get lodged in the olfactory epithelium, and these are the things that we call smells. And we can individuate them in terms of their olfactory qualities, right? So in this instance, this is going to be a citrus odorant. On the other hand, we have a different pathway for the olfactory system called retronasal olfaction, whereby the odorants are in the end usually within the mouth. And then as you chew on the food and begin to swallow, it pushes the odorants up against the back of the throat or the nasopharynx, and then against the back of the olfactory epithelium and out the nostrils. Right? And it turns out to be that retronasal olfaction is usually considered to be flavor, and we don't really recognize it as such. Now, the reason we don't usually recognize retronasal olfaction is because often, while we're chewing on the food is giving us some sort of tactile perception, and then we have something called oral referral. That since the stimulus feels like it's in our mouth, then we locate the olfactory quality as occurring within the mouth space. Now, the reason why we might think that retronasal olfaction and orthonasal olfaction are two different systems, and that orthonasal olfaction is smell and retronasal olfaction is not what we would consider smell, is that they dissociate. And they dissociate in interesting ways. So even though they share, for the most part, what we might consider the same kind of stimulus, odorants, even though they share the same kind of sensory transduction, the olfactory epithelium and the cortical relays, it turns out to be that they actually have different smells. So that if we take the same stimulus and we present it to the nose either orthonasally or retronasally, that the olfactory quality in the end is different between the two. The only two stimuli that I know of from the experimental literature that in the end have the same qualitative character based on the pathway is chocolate and lavender. Chocolate's one of these great examples because it's a great comfort food. And the reason why it might be a great comfort food is because what you smell and then what you taste are exactly the same. So the anticipation of the reward and the actual reward itself are the exact same thing. Whereas coffee, if you think about it, you smell coffee, it smells delicious, right? And then you taste coffee and you get the flavors of coffee, and it's not quite the same thing, right? Same stimulus for the most part, and it turns out to be it has two different olfactory qualities. Another way of dissociating the two is not just in terms of the olfactory qualities of the stimulus, but we can just think about how they dissociate in everyday life. Okay? So you might think about how you would dissociate between retronasal olfaction and orthonasal olfaction based upon arguments from everyday absence. So all of us at some stage every winter probably get some sort of nasal congestion or cold. Right? And when that happens, we don't get the smells coming out the front of our nose because it's blocked. So basically, you don't get the retronasal olfaction because the smell can't exit your nose. And in doing so, what you notice is that the things that you're eating, right, the miso soup in this example, right, only have gustatory qualities, but no retronasal olfactory qualities. And it's missing something, right? So we can already think it through that maybe taste and smell to some extent dissociate. And when you describe what's going on, you say that soup doesn't taste right. It doesn't have the right flavors, right? You're missing something. What you're missing is retronasal olfaction, but you don't describe it as missing smells of the soup. You're missing the flavors of the soup. Now, more so, if we're not just talking about everyday examples, we're thinking about clinical patients. So Landis has this great study where he has a whole bunch of clinical subjects present themselves, and they claim that they have no access to smells. At the same time, it turns out to be that they have access to tastes. And then he begins to look at this, and it looks like what they're missing is orthonasal olfaction, but not retronasal olfaction. So even in clinical cases, it turns out to be that the transduction at the front or the back of the olfactory epithelium and further cortical processing that underlies perception can dissociate. So even though we have what looks like one system with two different pathways, it's actually two different systems with two different kinds of qualities that we might have, and they can dissociate across everyday examples and clinical examples. So then the wonder becomes, well, if orthonasal olfaction is smell, what is retronasal olfaction? Because I'm claiming it's kind of flavor, but there's another candidate that we could talk about when it comes to flavor, and that would be gustation. Because most of the time, when we say that we taste something, what we really think we mean is that we're in the end having the experience of the tastes on our tongue. Now, the nice thing about gustation is a very simple system. And at least within the chemoreceptive sciences, it turns out to be that those who work on smell and those who work on gustation really like are two different camps. And when you show up at like ECRO or ACHEMS, people will instantly ask you, oh, you're a philosopher. Well, do you focus on taste or smell? And the moment you say smell, they're like light eyes light up and they kind of go like, okay, that's the right sense to talk about. Because gustation is boring for the most part. I mean, nothing against it. But we have maybe 4 to 5 different qualities when it comes to taste. We have sweet, sour, bitter, maybe umami. Maybe there might be something else when it comes to like alkalines or maybe something like bubbles. But it turns out that it has a very simplistic system, right? Whereby we have basic tastes. Now, the problem with, in the end, equating gustation with taste is that it doesn't fully capture what we mean about tasting flavors. More so, if we do dissociate the gustatory qualities on their own from all of the other qualities they might have from somatosensation within the oral cavity or with the retronasal olfaction, that basic tastings presented without some overlap with the other sensory modalities don't taste like they normally would. So even the gustatory qualities that we think about as flavors usually need this other, in the end, multisensory input to taste bitter, sour, sweet, umami in the way that we recognize in everyday life. More so, when we begin to think about gustation as taste, I think what we usually mean is that we don't really taste with our tongue, we taste things in our mouths. And so we're already expanding what we mean by tasting things. We place things in our mouths, and then the taste or the flavor turns out to be all the things in the oral cavity. And once we already expand our notion of what we consider to be taste, an everyday context, to not just be about the tongue, but about all of the sensors in the oral cavity, then it's not that far of a step to start thinking that maybe we don't just taste things in our mouths, we taste things in our head space. So this would then give us an image of exactly what the taste system would be. It would be all of the sensory systems within the oral cavity, together with retronasal olfaction. And I think this better captures what we mean by when we say that we taste flavors. So I think when we say we taste flavors, what we're really talking about is that we have something like flavor perception. And flavor perception is going to be a multisensory but unimodal experience. So here's a way of bringing this out. When we perceive flavors, we perceive a uniform experience that is a synthetic percept. So we have a complex entity in our headspace. And within the headspace, we experience it as a uniform entity which doesn't seem to have such dissociable parts. So when you think about imagining the flavor of gelato, you have this very strong experience that you have a uniform entity, and you kind of can probe the different sensory modalities that are in the end affecting it, but as you're probing it through in some sort of motor sensory contingencies over time. So if you think about how you do this with wine tasting, right? You swill the wine first, you sniff it, you put it in your oral cavity, you do all those things with your mouth, and all of those probings allow you to then have different experiences of this uniform phenomena. So diachronically over time, it presents as complex, but at a given time synchronically, you seem to have a unified synthetic experience. So that's my claim about the perception of flavor. The wonder then is going to be, well, if that's how flavor is, how is the imagery of flavor supposed to be? Okay, so if we have these multisensory but unimodal experiences of flavor, do we also have multisensory but still uniform unimodal imagery of flavors? Now, there's a problem that we run into, especially if I'm going to inhabit the quasi-perceptual process, and this derives from Benz-Nané. So he says, at some stage in one of the writings, that olfactory mental imagery is olfactory perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding olfactory sensory stimulation. Olfactory mental imagery can be, and often is, triggered by non-olfactory, for example, auditory sensory stimulation, and this is exactly what I mean by multimodal mental imagery. So here's the problem that I'm making for myself, unfortunately. I'm inhabiting Nané's approach to mental imagery, that is quasi-perceptual processing in the absence of sensory innervation, but I'm also claiming that flavor is multisensory but unimodal. So how do I differentiate between multimodal flavor imagery and unimodal flavor imagery? To make matters worse, let's imagine a case of olfactory imagery. Right? So let's imagine that in the end, Bensei is imagining the smell of strawberries. We can all kind of do it, right? And when you're imagining the smell of strawberries, what I think we're doing is we're imagining what it's like to sniff strawberries. But when I start asking you, can you imagine the flavor of the strawberry? It's not quite clear what I'm asking you to imagine, right? Am I imagining that I'm chewing the strawberry? Am I imagining the retronasal experience of the strawberry? And it's not clear. Moreover, it turns out to be that since olfaction, at least retronasal olfaction, is part of this unimodal modality of flavor perception, then it's unclear how the olfactory qualities that we're imagining are supposed to be bound together with the taste or the gustatory experiences. And there's a whole bunch of experiments that are kind of interesting about this. So, for instance, if we ask people to imagine the smell of a strawberry, and then we give them a fluid on their tongue with a very limited amount of sucrose, where it's just subliminal, then all of a sudden we can start to, in the end, taste the gustatory sweet quality because we're already imagining the smell of strawberry. So there seems to be a cross-modal effect of olfactory orthonasal qualities on flavor perception. Moreover, it turns out to be that when I ask you to imagine sweet tastes, and then I ask you to imagine the smell of strawberry, all of a sudden the vividness of the olfactory taste, of the gustatory taste imagery increases. So just in the imagination case, it turns out to be that orthonasal imagery can affect gustatory imagery. And so I think there's a problem here of trying to figure out, well, if we have a multisensory but unimodal flavor experience, how is this formatted and how do the different, in the end, parts of the imagery work together? So what I'm going to now run through is what do we know about, in the end, the different, in the end, sensory modalities in terms of imagery, starting with smell and then gustation and then flavor perception. Okay, so the first thing we might want to get out of the way is whether or not we even have olfactory imagery. So going back to the 1980s, there was this large claim that people had that we have no olfactory imagery and that it's completely impossible to generate volitional imagery. I don't think this is exactly true, but it turns out to be there's a good reason why people might think this is the case. When you start asking the population about whether or not they can then volitionally generate olfactory imagery, it turns out to be it's very limited. Depending on the study that you're looking at, it can be as low as 4% of the population claims that they can imagine smells without some sort of sensory innervation. And there are some studies that show that this could have a wider effect. So there's a study by Zach, I think going back to 2018, where they showed across their three different portions of the population, something like 14% of their sample could have vivid olfactory imagery. Up to 65% of their group could have some weak olfactory imagery, and something like 22 to 35% of their cohort had no olfactory imagery whatsoever. Now, the thing to bear in mind about their study is when they were asking people to imagine smells, and this was something fascinating to me, they were asking people to imagine the smell of French fries. Now, when you ask someone to imagine French fries, it's unclear if you're asking them to imagine the smell, the orthonasal sniffing of French fries, or the gustatory and flavor imagery of French fries. And so one of the reasons why, at least in the literature, people think that they showed that 65% of the population have something like olfactory imagery is because they're using flavor imagery as opposed to orthonasal imagery. If I ask you to imagine the smell of citrus, or I ask you to imagine the smell of pine, then it turns out to be this is a lot harder, given that these are just orthonasal smells. And then that portion of the population might be something like 4%. So it turns out that when we start asking about things that look like flavor imagery as opposed to orthonasal imagery, that the percentage of the population who's able to generate volitional imagery is a lot stronger, a lot wider. And it turns out to be the imagery itself is more robust and a lot, in the end, vivid. Now, this turns out to be examples of voluntary imagery that is occurring consciously. It has some sort of allocentric representation in space, and there's a sense of presence of the imagery when the person is having it. But this is not the only kind of olfactory imagery that we might have. And to contrast this, the reason why people might have claimed that we don't have olfactory imagery is when you start asking the population if they can do visual imagery, something like 90 to 96% of the population easily can volitionally imagine an image of an apple or the shape of a Necker cube or the last time they saw sunset. And only somewhere around 6% of the population has trouble with visual imagery. I'm also told by sociologists that philosophers kind of group in the no area, which might explain why we had those debates with Fodor and Politian so strongly. I mean, not to in the end give any sort of background area other than like the theories, but it might just be that Jerry Fodor couldn't possibly imagine anything, and that's why he had no imagery whatsoever and had to be propositions. But bracketing that, right? In the general population, olfactory imagery shifts the other way, right? It's kind of just the exact opposite of visual imagery. But we can not only generate volitional olfactory imagery, it occurs in a lot of other places. And it turns out to be this is one of the upsides of Nene's approach, that we can have other kinds of imagery. So autobiographical memories when it comes to smells are very strong. This is the Proust effect that people like to talk about from time to time, that all of a sudden you have a smell experience. The smell experience takes you back to a childhood moment, like you're back at Christmas eating pfeffernusse of some variety, and you have this strong experience of the smell of Christmas cookies, right? Or you smell popcorn and all of a sudden it takes you to a county fair, depending upon what kind of example you want to use. And these are good examples of conscious experiences that are voluntary most of the time, right? So we might sniff something to try to elicit the past experience. We actually use this as an intervention in Alzheimer's disease nowadays. They also occur involuntary, right? You walk into a Christmas market and all of a sudden you're thrown back to the experience of being 4 years old and being in the same place in the same time period, right? And it turns out to be they have a felt sense of presence, right? Either you have this sense that you have mentally time traveled back in time, or that the smell is right now imbuing yourself in the environment in some way. We also have olfactory hallucinations, whereby you have the experience of an olfactory image without, in the end, the enervation of it. The example that I like to use, and sorry, this is kind of gross, is cacosomia. Everything smells like poop. So this is not a good hallucination. And it turns out to be this is involuntary. You're not choosing to smell these things. It's kind of horrible to you. It turns out to be it's usually conscious. It has an egocentric space component to it. So a lot of times when you have olfactory parasomias, the smells are coming from a direction. Sometimes, oddly enough, they appear in only one nostril and not in both nostrils. So it's a question about if it's really perceptual or not. And they have a real strong sense of presence, right? The smell of poop for these clinical populates turns out to be stuck in their nose. And sometimes you'll even see them like massaging their nose, trying to get this hallucinatory smell out of their nose. We also have examples of, in the end, olfactory imagery in dream sleep, whereby it turns out to be that if you wake someone up from their dreams, then they will sometimes report that they have olfactory imagery during the dream. Also, we have, in the end, subjective reports where we ask people to report upon their dreams and how often they have smells in their dreams. And this would be a good example of involuntary imagery that is, depending on what your definition of consciousness might be, unconscious. Now, the problem that we run into with all of these examples is that we're asking someone to subjectively, introspectively report that they're having some sort of image component. And the worry might be is that maybe people are lying, right? Or maybe it turns out to be that they're not quite sure what they're doing and they want to please the experimenter, right? And so the wonder that we often get is when someone says that they're imagining a smell, how do we know that they're really imagining the smell? And I think one way of getting at this would be in terms of what I call secondary measures. So we look at behavioral measures and we compare what's going on in the perceptual state to the imagery state. And if these secondary measures of the perceptual state are the same in the imagery state, then they provide something like convergent validity. So one example that you could use is sniffing. We can think this through kind of easily. If I, in the end, was giving this talk in person and I came and I had this cupcake and it was a brown cupcake and I was like, hey guys, here's a shit cupcake, have a sniff. I know that's gross and I would never do that to you, but I mean, you would still take a sniff, right? I mean, even if I'm like, this smells horrible, this is not edible, you're a curious human being and I'm asking you to do something in a white shirt, so you follow directions. But at the same time, you don't want to sniff it, right? Because it's just been told that this is a khaki smelling thing. So you take a little sniff. Whereas if I came and I said, here, this is a Belgian chocolate truffled cupcake, then you take a big sniff and go, because it's a pleasant smell. And it turns out to be that when we imagine smells, depending upon the overall hedonics of the imagined smell, the sniff rates are the same, the volume of sniff inhalation is the same, the respiratory rates are the same, because it turns out to be that bad smells make us nervous and our heart rate and respiratory rates go up. And calming smells like lavender turn out to give us calming effects. And so the secondary measures of imagery are the same. So under experimental conditions, if you ask someone to, in the end, imagine smelling something like rotten egg versus lavender, the secondary sniffing measures are the same between the two, between perception and imagery. We can also corroborate this based upon brain areas, that the same brain areas that turn out to be lighting up, as we like to put it, right, turn out to be the same brain areas between imagery and perception, to an extent that we can even, to some extent, within the piriform cortex over here in the middle, the PC of the olfactory processing centers, it looks like we can begin to demarcate the different kinds of valences that you're imagining in the same way that we can demarcate the different kinds of valences when you're perceiving. So we have a lot of, in the end, evidence that we have this robust ability for olfactory imagery, and that olfactory imagery, when it is in the end done by a subject, looks like it's the same kind of a state as when we're actually perceiving the stimulus. Okay, more so, we can give further evidence that's the same kind of a thing based upon what would be general perceptual effects of olfaction. So when we take binary mixtures in olfaction, we combine them together, we usually get one of two different kinds of mixture effects. We take two smells, we put them together, and then we have an elemental effect, whereby we have a new complex smell, but we can easily identify the component parts within the smell. Okay, so here's a simple one. Everyone can imagine the smell of gasoline. Right? I mean, maybe less so now that we have EVs, and everyone can imagine the smell of, in the end, strawberries, right? Because we've now primed this with Benz's imagining strawberries. When you imagine the combinations of gasoline and strawberries, you get an elemental effect, whereby you have like two very strong smells side by side. But sometimes, in fact, most of the time, when we have two smells and we mix them together, or more than two smells, we get a configural effect, or some people like to call this, in the end, a synthetic effect. So you take lime and you take lemon and you put them together, and what you get is 7-Up or Sprite, depending upon whatever brand you prefer, right? Does it smell lemony, limey? Yeah, kind of, but it smells like Sprite. It's its own entity. And if I ask you what are the component parts, you can't in the end identify the component parts. It's just a new smell. Okay. And so in that sense, most of the time when we take a bunch of odorants that are different and we put them together, what we get is configural smells. We get a new olfactory quality. We recognize it as a complex olfactory quality. We can tell that it has parts, but we can't identify the parts within it. And it turns out the same is true when it comes to imagining smells. Okay, so we can do this if we were thinking about pasta sauces, right? You put together the requisite usual 3 ingredients, whatever those might be, and then we might add in some extra ingredients if we're thinking about tomato sauce that would differentiate the different sauces, right? When you smell it, you can smell it as that kind of sauce. But if I ask you, based upon the smell alone, can you decompose it into its component parts? You kind of go like, I get a few. I can chunk it to some extent. And this is usually called the Lang effect, that in any complex olfactory mixture, we can identify at most 3 to 4 of the component parts. Right now, when it comes to flavor experiences, this is really interesting, right? Because the average cuisine, we'll talk about this at some stage, starts with usually like 3 component parts that give it its base flavor. And then they might add in extra components that will give it depth of flavor. And every time you smell these flavors, you can begin to identify what culinary cuisine are we talking about based upon this chunking effect of the 3 or 4 primary smells that in the end compose this one culinary grouping. Now, it turns out to be the same is true when we imagine smells, that when we imagine smells, we can imagine something like a complex perfume, but we can only have a few component parts. Okay, so the claim that I then get out of this, at least in terms of perception, is that olfaction employs what I usually call a non-conceptual, in the end, compositional format, or a FNCC, which doesn't really help you. But here's the way of thinking about this. When we have olfactory perception, we have complex percepts that are formed from component parts, but we don't have access to the component parts, and we can't decompose the component parts. And this looks very different than when we start thinking about visual depictions or visual representations, whereby we have access to all the component parts. So if I asked you to imagine a Necker cube in your mind's eye, right, 94 to 96% of the population should have no problem with this. And then if I ask you, can you imagine the lines and the edges and what's the interior and the exterior of the Necker cube in your mind's eye, you're able to do that. But if I ask you to imagine in the end something like a perfume, and I ask you to imagine the component parts, you don't kind of get it. You get the perfume, you get kind of intensities and valences to some extent. You might get top notes, like it's floral or it might be woody, but you're not getting the full range of component parts. And the same is true between the perceptual state and the olfactory imagery states. So a way of putting this is when we start thinking about olfactory representations, both of the perceptual and the imagery variety, we have a complex representation that is formed from the parts, but we don't have access to the parts in the complex at that given time. And when we probe it over time, at most what we get is 3 to 4 components for each time we imagine it or each time we re-sniff it. Now, this is going to be very different than gustation. So when you start looking at gustatory imagery is quite possible. We can imagine sweetness, or in the end, sourness, or bitterness, or saltiness, and we can even imagine umami to some extent. Now, the problem that we run into when it comes to gustatory imagery is, at least according to my reading of the literature recently, we have no estimates of the prevalence of gustatory imagery across the population. No one's really given us an estimate of like how frequent this might be within the population or how many people can do it. And it looks like just about everyone I've asked, which is of course weird, right? But if you're working on the topic, then of course you're walking around the halls asking your fellow faculty and your students like, can you imagine tastes? And seeing what they respond. And it looks like this is kind of like vision, from what I can tell, which is of course hearsay and not experimental. But most of us can have in the end gustatory imagery. Moreover, it turns out to be that when we have gustatory imagery, in the same way that we can demarcate in the end sour and sweet and bitter and salty as basic tastes when it comes to perception, then and then in terms of imagery, we can also imagine the basic tastings as well. In addition to being able to, in the end, imagine the basic tastings, it turns out that we can begin to demarcate where the basic tastings are happening within the insula. So over here, next to the olfactory cortex, we can in the end decode what basic tastings you're tasting, right? So if we place salty, sweet, bitter on your tongue, we can then see the activation in the insula. And it turns out to be that when you imagine these, in the end, basic tastings, those same areas can be, in the end, decoupled from each other using, in the end, fMRI or MEG results. Okay, so we have something like almost a line-line system that the percept and the imagery overlaps in the same basic cortical areas, which gives us an argument to think that maybe when it comes to gustatory imagery might use something more similar to vision or language, which I call concatenative compositionality, whereby the claim is going to be the complex representation must preserve tokens of an expression's constituents and their sequential relations in the expression. And given that it's either really early in the day for me or really late in the afternoon for you, and these are big words, let me give you some images to kind of bring this out. So imagine that we have a bunch of primitives. If we have a concatenative system, then we take those primitives and we put them together and we form a complex. The meaning of the complex, right, in the end, representational value of the complex is simply a matter of the spatial temporal juxtaposition of the token parts, right? So everyone can see the crayons. The crayons in the end, just simply when they're put together, generate the image of a face, right? And if you move around the crayons so that you don't have the darkness and the shadowing around the eyes or around the mouth, all of a sudden the image changes. And so taste looks like this. It looks like when we begin to, in the end, perceive taste, tastes have this nice kind of concatenative structure where I can taste something that is salty and sweet at the same time, or bitter and sour at the same time. And they're fully dissociable. Similarly, when I ask you to imagine, in the end, smells, so if you look at the citrus, you can imagine which one of these are going to be sour, which ones are going to be sweet, which ones are going to be bitter. And it turns out to be that even when you're imagining the sweet ones, it's still citrus. So there's still like a sour component in the imagery per se. And these can be dissociated within your mind, which is kind of interesting as far as I'm concerned. But that would then mean that if gustatory imagery is part of flavor imagery, then we're going to run into this problem that if olfactory imagery is in the end not concatenative, but gustatory imagery is concatenative and flavor imagery is supposed to be unimodal, then how is it that these two formats work together? Okay, so it's going to be a problem that will come back to bite me at some stage. But once again, if we were talking about gustatory imagery, how do we know that people are actually not lying or confabulating, right? And again, we might say that these are subjective reports. So how do we know that people are actually imagining something with gustatory qualities in the absence of sensory innervation? Well, we could use in the end secondary measures again. We can't use sniff rates. We could use in the end salivatory rates. So if I ask you to imagine something that is sweet, you'll have an increased production of saliva because all of a sudden you're prepping to taste something sweet. If I'm asking you to imagine something bitter, then it turns out to be you have a decrease in salivatory rates. And it turns out to be that this, once again, is exactly the same or close enough to, in the end, actual perceptions of basic tastings. So that in the end, salivatory rates, in the end, track the perceptual quality of basic tastings, whether or not they're perceived or whether or not they're imagined. Also, as mentioned before, the same cortical areas that underlie the percepts of basic tastings are in the end activated when we have the percepts of mental imagery of gustatory qualities. The problem that we run into is that's just gustation, right? And if flavor is supposed to be multisensory and it's supposed to include retronasal olfaction, trigeminal stimulation, thermal perception, tactile perception in the mouth, then do we have flavor imagery? We have olfactory imagery, orthonasal olfactory imagery, we have gustatory imagery, but it turns out to be that there is no study, to the best of my knowledge and to the best of, in the end, Charles Spence's knowledge from his reviews, that tests just retronasal imagery. And I've been trying to think about like how you would even try to ask someone to imagine in the end retronasal smells. Given that most of the time when we talk about retronasal tastes, we're actually thinking about this as all within the oral cavity. So it seems really hard to even introspect what a retronasal smell would be and how to imagine that, right? I mean, maybe we could ask you like, can you imagine the flavor of soup? But then when you start imagining the flavor of soup, there's lots of gustatory qualities that come with that. So we have no in evidence about retronasal imagery. Turns out that we also have no evidence about trigeminal imagery, whereby we just don't know. And so this becomes a problem for trying to figure out, well, what about taste imagery? If my claim is that we taste flavors and flavors are multisensory but unimodal, then can we really form taste imagery? And most of the time when you have something that's called taste imagery in the experiments that are supposed to be testing gustatory imagery, it's unclear whether or not the subjects are being asked to imagine the flavor or the gustatory quality. And the way that this is usually done is we present a picture. And then we ask people from the picture, can you imagine what this tastes like? And since that's the only instruction given, it's not really clear if you're supposed to be imagining the sweetness of the, in the end, ice cream, or that you're supposed to be imagining the flavor of it, the vanilla flavor, which would clearly be a retronasal smell, or you're supposed to be imagining some combination thereof. And so all of the evidence that we have about in the end taste imagery, which most people think is gustatory imagery, might also be in the end evidence about flavor imagery. So going back to that initial slide that we had way back when we were talking about the prevalence of olfactory imagery, the example being used there was in the end the smell of French fries. So it might be that our evidence for the prevalence of olfactory imagery is actually about the prevalence of flavor imagery. In fact, when you look at older studies on olfactory imagery and asking people, can they imagine the smells of things, often you're asked to imagine something that would be a food source. So there was one study done by White in 1950s where he showed that something like 50% of the population cannot imagine the smell of cooking caramelized onions. But caramelized onions to me sound like a flavor imagery, right? I mean, so if you ask me to think about the smell of it, what I'm actually thinking about is something like French onion soup in my mouth. And so then it might be that what I'm imagining is not actually olfactory orthonasal smell, but a retronasal image. So the prevalence is unclear. I think that a lot of the evidence that we have for orthonasal olfactory imagery might actually be evidence for flavor imagery. And that the dichotomy that we have, or the difference between the findings about a low level of orthonasal imagery And this other stuff that 65% of the population might be would be whether or not we're asking about explicit orthonasal smells or retronasal flavor experiences. So I think the prevalence is up in the air, and as of yet, there's no experimental evidence that shows one way or the other teases them apart. One really interesting bit of the literature, though, is it turns out to be that when we start looking at flavor imagery and we tell people to just imagine the flavors of the food as they're consuming it, beyond the gustatory qualities, that those people that have higher levels of vivid mental imagery for flavors actually have higher food cravings. To the extent that since you can imagine the flavor profile of the thing, that your food craving goes up. And it turns out that this then modulates actual flavor cravings that then over the course of 2 years has a predictive effect on, in the end, BMI increases. So it turns out that if we study this in the population, those with better flavor imagery turn out to, in the end, over time, eat more food or something along those lines in a few studies. So we do have some, in the end, evidence that, in the end, flavor imagery has behavioral effects. Additionally, it turns out to be that when we start looking at how to describe flavor imagery, that it does have a mouthfeel component. So this is some study that was done by Kreumann and Wang a few years back, where it turns out to be that when you describe a wine and you ask people to imagine the wine, if you include the mouthfeel of the wine in the flavor imagery, or at least the description of it, then the flavor imagery is even more vivid. So we can easily, well, I don't know if easily, but people can imagine the different flavors of different wines, right? So you can ask someone to imagine the difference between, in the end, a Merlot or a Chardonnay. And since Reno is right next to Napa, people talk about Chardonnays more than ever. And then you start talking about the buttery feel of the Chardonnay on your mouth, right? As opposed to like the stringent experience of a Pinot. I mean, there are lots of wine snobs around here, so sorry. But the wine feel, right, and the mouth feel seems to, in the end, compose part of the flavor experience. Now, what Kreumann and Wang showed was not only if we increase the, in the end, mental imagery with increasing descriptions of mouthfeel, do we have increased mental imagery, but the increased mental imagery actually, in the end, will then affect the overall, in the end, cravings for wine. So people that don't have vivid flavor imagery, who read the descriptions, all of a sudden have heightened vividness of mental imagery that increases their cravings for tasting that kind of a wine. Whereas people with very strong olfactory mental imagery that read the description, then it turns out to be it lessens the overall qualitative character of the imagery, and then it lessens their overall effect on wanting to drink the wine. So it has a nice behavioral modulation, not as much as the other secondary effects that we might have for at least gustatory imagery or flavor or orthonasal imagery, but nonetheless, it has some nice behavioral effects. So we can show that when people are imagining things, that it turns out to be they're actually imagining. Additionally, it turns out to be that when we start talking about flavor imagery and mixture components, that when I ask you to imagine flavors, usually you're a lot better if you know what the component parts are. So if I imagine in the end something like French cuisine, and I ask you to imagine the average mirepoix, then you're imagining something that has some onion notes and some celery and some sort of carrot notes to it as well. When we begin to shift from at least French cuisine to something like classic Spanish cuisine, then you might take out in the end the carrots and substitute in something along the lines of peppers. And then all of a sudden you get a base for a lot of Spanish dishes. And you can easily imagine the flavor profiles of those. Similar things happen when you start imagining things like in the end Asian cuisines, depending upon whether or not it's going to be garlic and ginger and chive, or it's going to be garlic and ginger and soy sauce. And you can begin to modulate the basic components of flavor profiles. But then the depth of flavor that you begin to imagine or perceive about different cuisines comes into the Lang effect, whereby you have this chunking, where you have a complex experience and you can only get a few, in the end, component parts. Similarly, when we start thinking about the experience of, in the end, eating gelato in your mind's eye, you might be able to get the sweetness, right? And if you're imagining something like stracciatella, maybe you might get some sort of extra, in the end, orthonasal flavors as well. But you're not going to get much more than 3 to 4 component parts in your imagery at any given time. So then that question becomes, well, then what is the format of flavor imagery? And I think the problem that I run into at the very least is given that it's multisensory, but it's unimodal, what you get is you get this, in the end, synchronic, complex experience But the synchronic complex experience skews depending upon whether or not gustatory imagery is going to be the primary component part or retronasal olfaction is going to be the primary component part. Because gustatory imagery has a nice, in the end, concatenative structure to it. And then the images that we get when the gustatory component is going to be primary are going to be more concatenative. And it turns out that this actually, in the end, is what we see when you start asking about flavor imagery. So if I ask you to imagine something that is primarily salty, right, like potato chips, then given that the gustatory salty component is the primary thing in the potato chip, then that's going to give you more of an elemental, right, experience or more of a concatenative experience. Whereas if I ask you to imagine something like the sweetness of a strawberry, given that the sweetness of a strawberry is going to be a primarily orthonasal or olfactory quality, then it's going to skew more towards, in the end, something like a functionally compositional or in the end, configural, in the end, mental imagery. So the problem that I run into is the very least that even though it's supposed to be some sort of unimodal experience, given that it's caused by, in the end, multisensory arrays, it can have different kinds of formats. And then, since I've argued elsewhere, these are incompatible formats, the question is, how is it that one system can use two different kinds of formats that are not supposed to work together? And the honest answer is, I don't know. So if you figure this out, then we can co-author a paper, you write it up, I'll stick my name on it. We'll say both authors contributed equally to the whole thing, but I don't have a good answer. It seems like this is a problem for my approach, and I have to just go, I don't know. But here's something cool. Why are we better at flavor imagery then? I mean, so if the whole thing seems to skew to the fact that when we begin to ask you to imagine flavors, not just gustatory basic tastes, not just orthonasal in the end smells, but flavors, then it turns out to be that 65% of the population can do this and kind of strongly, almost to the extent that it's almost as strong as visual or auditory imagery, which are supposed to be the dominant forms of mental imagery. So why are we good at mental imagery? One reason might be there's just more cortical connectivity. So the flavor system turns out to overlap with the olfactory system as well. It in the end overlaps with the hypothalamus and the thalamus. It in the end innervates certain parts of, in the end, the brainstem. And so you might just think that the more areas that in the end are brought online to generate the mental imagery, the more robust it's going to be. So that might be one argument. In the same way that when we begin to think about why vision is so dominant, right? One reason might be is because when vision takes up something like a fourth of the cortex, then it's going to be more dominant in general when we have mental imagery or in the end visual experiences. So that might be one reason. Another reason might be because of lexical mediation. When I ask you to imagine smells and I in the end describe the smell auditorily, you're kind of good at it. When I give you the word, right, the written word for what you're supposed to orthonasally be imagining, you're not quite as good. And it turns out to be that when we try to elicit smell imagery using language, we're kind of bad. And smell and language turn out to have a rather difficult relationship to them, such that when I ask you to name a smell, so that I give you a smell and I ask you to give me the exact lexical tag for that smell, you're really bad at this. It turns out like 30% of the stimuli you can actually name, 60 to 70% you can't, as opposed to visual imagery where I give you a color or I give you a shape and you're at 90% accuracy most of the time. But when it comes to, in the end, flavor imagery, whether or not I give you an auditory, in the end, description, or I give you a lexical description written on the screen, or I give you a picture, it turns out to be that all of these are equally good at eliciting flavor imagery. So it looks like there's more lexical mediation of flavor imagery than there might be of orthonasal imagery. And this also turns out to be true when we start thinking about expertise. So people who have an expertise in cooking turn out to be better at flavor imagery. And only for flavor imagery, it's relative to the modality. And it looks like not necessarily just chefs, but anyone who's involved in something like flavor generation is also better at mental imagery and talking about smells and flavors. So there's this one great study done by Ben Safi, whereby he asks people in the end how often they cook. And then he asks them to do some cooking and then asks them, well, how much mental imagery can they have? And it turns out to be that cooks have in the end more robust mental imagery when it comes to flavors and smells than the end non-cooks. Then you might think that that would then mean that professional chefs should be great when it comes to mental imagery. But Casillas and Majid do this interesting study of professional chefs versus herbalists in Iranian society. And they noticed that herbalists within Iranian society, who in the end combined different in the end herbs to generate different medicinal powders, turn out to be better at naming the things that they can smell and the mental imagery of that thereof too. So the more experience that we have with, in the end, using the perceptual stimuli, the better we are at, in the end, naming it and imagining it. So it might turn out to be that really the reason why we're better at flavor imagery than orthonasal imagery or gustatory imagery might be that the more perception that we have and the more attention that we have to perception, the better we are at imagining things. So I don't know about you, but I mean, I like in the end talking about food. I mean, I think Italian culture is quite well known for this, right? Where it turns out to be that by the time you're having lunch, you're already thinking about dinner to some extent. And maybe within my household, it's kind of the same thing. Like we're having breakfast at the table and my kids are asking me like, what's for lunch and dinner already? I'm like, leave me alone. I don't even want to think about that. But if it turns out to be that you're talking about and thinking about food throughout your daily lives, it might be that you're better at describing smells. And it turns out that this is borne out by, in the end, inter and cross-cultural linguistic data. So Thai, for instance, that is spoken by tens of thousands of people, have an odor lexicon, whereby they have explicit words that are only used to talk about smells. And despite this claim that they're smells, when you actually look at their odor lexicon, they're more flavor words than anything else. And at least in Thailand, cuisine is talked about continually and constantly across the day. Not just what they're going to eat, but what ingredients to use and what ingredients are fresh and what ingredients to substitute in recipes. And so the claim is going to be the more you attend to the perceptual stimulus, the better you are at describing it just because you have greater in the end sensory templates at play, and that will increase your overall mental imagery profile. So I think one thing that comes out of all of this is the reason why we're better at flavor imagery than orthonasal imagery or gustatory imagery is because we attend more to the perception of it. And if it turns out to be that mental imagery is quasi-perceptual processing, then more perception should lead to better mental imagery. At least that would be one prediction that's borne out. The problem that we run into is that if it turns out to be that it's perceptual imagery, and it's supposed to be in the end use the same perceptual systems, then it should have the same format. And the problem that we have with flavor is it's not clear what format flavor is using. It looks like it uses both gustatory imagery format and orthonasal imagery format. And so that's going to be an open area of research. Okay, and that then wraps it up. So thank you for your attention and your imagery, of course. And I will smell you later when I see you.
Thank you very much, Ben. We're gonna take like very short break, like 2 minutes, so people can grab a glass of water and think about the questions, and then we come back for the Q&A.